So there's this amazing little YouTube channel that I've come across recently called Farming Explained, and it's only got about 8,000 subscribers on YouTube at the moment. I think it deserves a lot more than that. But I was watching a video on Farming Explained yesterday, all about methane emissions from agriculture, and I've done videos about this before, but I think it bears repeating, and I think it bears going into perhaps a little bit more detail on this issue of methane emissions in agriculture and agriculture's impact on the environment, hence its impact on global warming and the climate and so on and so forth. So I think the first thing to bear in mind at the outset of this video is that methane in the environment is, or in the atmosphere, is concentrated at far lower levels than CO2 is. CO2 forms 0.04% of our atmosphere, which is not a very great amount at all, really. But it nonetheless, yeah, forms 0.04% of our atmosphere and is thought to lead to global warming as a result of this. And methane is 28 has a propensity to cause global warming that's 28 times that of carbon dioxide, but it exists in far lower concentrations in the atmosphere. So compared to this 0.04% statistic, methane exists in the atmosphere at 0.00017% of the atmosphere. This means that in spite of there being an amount of methane in the environment causing this global warming, in spite of the fact that methane's propensity to cause global warming is 28 times that of carbon dioxide, methane's contribution to global warming is still 8.4 times less than that of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide still causes 8.4 times as much warming as methane does. That's the first point to dispose of when it comes to the impact of agriculture on the climate. Agriculture causes a negligible amount of CO2 emissions. It does cause quite a high amount of methane emissions. It causes some nitrous oxide emissions also. But accounting for, that and taking everything into consideration, we find, I think, that the impact of agriculture is far less since it emits far less CO2. We also find in agriculture that the plants we grow on farms for feeding livestock and so on, those sequester carbon dioxide. So you need to think about also the origins of these methane emissions. Where are they coming from? They're coming from digested plant materials ingested by livestock animals, such as grass, silage, maize, all these sorts of things that either graze directly or it goes into creating silage to later on feed to animals. It all comes from plant materials. So the methane has nowhere else to come from other than plant matter that's being digested by ruminant livestock and other forms of livestock. So that all comes from the fields ultimately, and if it's coming from the fields where it's grown, where photosynthesis is happening, right, and carbon dioxide is being turned into plants, and being metabolized in plants in photosynthesis, then that's all coming from the environment. It's all sequestering CO2 and taking it out of the atmosphere and locking it up in plant matter, which is then later on fed to livestock. So and this is the big point that Joseph Poore and so on, these researchers from Oxford University and so on, failed to take into consideration. They're putting out research now that's suggesting that agriculture has this huge negative impact on the climate, that we should all go vegan and convert to plant-based diets because that'll be better for the environment somehow. But it's untrue, since novel emissions of methane can't come from agriculture, or novel emissions of CO2 equivalent can't come from agriculture, because agriculture is already sequestering CO2, and the amount of methane that's emitted must be in proportion to the amount of CO2 sequestered, since there's no other place for the methane to come from other than from digested plant material. So in terms of CO2 equivalents emitted into the atmosphere, agriculture doesn't emit anything because it already offsets the amount of CO2 equivalent that's being emitted via agriculture because it's sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere. So there's no novel emissions of methane coming out there as a result of our interventions, as a result of our farming practices. And farming is, well, is one of the major ways in which we're actually taking CO2 out of the environment. We take it out of the environment, it gets turned into methane, sent back into the environment for 10 years or whatever it is until methane deteriorates and leaves the atmosphere. So yeah, it's a very prickly, contentious point of researching the climate. I think it's a totally misguided enterprise. I think it's highly politicized. It's highly politicized uh, with activists and vegans who all espouse the same sort of nonsense, really. This idiotic case against agriculture. They all espouse the same thing, that agriculture causes methane emissions, hence it's bad for the environment, hence it's causing global warming and so on and so forth, whereas nothing could be further from the truth, because agriculture actually sequesters CO2 in livestock feed that's fed back to livestock, and methane emissions results. So there's there's a net zero element to it. Agriculture is net zero because it sequesters CO2. That's been unaccounted for in the research put out by these people. And Joseph Poor is a vegan himself, so he's obviously got no bias at all whatsoever in this case. And me, I'm from a farming background, so obviously I'm the most biased person in the room. But I'm also credit myself with some degree of scientific integrity, and I credit myself with, as a scientist, being able to see multiple different sides of the argument, being able to come up with nuanced and novel interpretations of um, these phenomena that are going on, by having recourse to the statistics as they are extant, and being able to have recourse to the research as it stands, and being able to see the shortcomings of that research, and being able to see, yeah, where things don't tally up really quite exactly. And yeah, so, and I think a lot of the time research gets put out there because it's of the moment, it's zeitgeisty, it's it has a large following, so it's likely to be very popular among um, not necessarily academics, but among a mainstream activist movement such as the vegan activist movement. And for all these sorts of reasons, you know, it ends up getting out there and put out there and published and funded and all this other stuff that is a little bit unfortunate, since it seems to be based on very, very myopic scientific perspectives, since it seems to be based upon a kind of perspective whereby a whole um, area of the statist the well, a whole area of scientific consideration is being left out of the discussion, and it seems to me that that's very bad for having an informed, open, and honest discussion about science or about a scientific topic, where you can't really have that without getting shouted down and shadow banned on the internet, and having indoctrinated people scuttle to your door and uh, loudly decry your insanity or that you're wrong or whatever, and basically give you a hard time. So yeah, I don't enjoy necessarily engaging in those sorts of discussions, but those discussions are very important, since we're talking about the future of farming, agriculture, the food chain, the food supply, where our food's going to come from in the future. It's all very, very important stuff, of course. But Yeah, I think we need to be looking at these sort of climate change based arguments to do with methane from a very informed perspective, and from a perspective that exhibits no small amount of balance in the ways in which we aggregate our understanding of climate change based on methane arguments and so on. So yeah, 8.4 times as much warming is still caused by carbon dioxide in the environment compared to methane, since the concentrations of carbon dioxide is so much greater than that of methane. So really, I think we should be focusing more on cutting down our CO2 emissions than our methane emissions, to tackle climate change. And we need to remember also that in agriculture, the smelly methane that comes out of cows, of course, has resulted from cows being fed grass, maize, etc., and that this grass, maize, etc., locks up CO2 from the atmosphere, so that the amount of methane they emit is is directly proportional to the amount of CO2 that's been sequestered in their livestock food. So no novel emissions of methane could be coming, or no novel emissions of CO2 equivalents in terms of methane could be coming from livestock. Um, the other consideration is also as to where the true emissions of methane are coming from, since methane concentrations in the atmosphere have been increasing over the past 200 years. But where have these emissions of methane come from then? Surely this has come from agriculture. Surely this has come from an expansion of our livestock farming enterprises and so on. I wouldn't have agreed with that perspective either. I would have said that the novel emissions of methane over the last 200 years have been coming from our exploits in oil and gas drilling, and that leaks as a result, leaks from the process of oil and gas drilling releases huge amounts of methane into the environment, and this is where the novel emissions of methane have been coming from over the past 200 years. So yeah, I don't think that it necessarily comes from agriculture, and that agriculture is probably about the least emitting industry that there is globally, and that we should be focusing more on heavy industry, transportation, and all these other sectors that contribute vastly greater levels of CO2 emissions than agriculture, and focus more on those instead of agriculture, and focus on downgrading our carbon footprints that way. And that's my basic point in this video. So thank you for watching, everybody. Bye bye bye. Love you lots. I'll see you soon. Sorry it was a bit rambling and incoherent, and sorry there was a kettle boiling during this video, but it is what it is. And thank you very much.